Hey, greetings. So, I speak my own truth, in respect and love I live, inspiration I will seek, inspiration I will give. So that is the modern day Bardic vow, which was kind of brought into being for the Exeter Bardic Chair, but has spread to other ones. I think Glastonbury still use that Bardic vow. It's a vow just to yourself, not to anyone else. So, time to talk about Bardic chairs and what they are, which is not easy. It's a long and convoluted subject, fascinating subject, and an area where there are kind of lots of gaps, if you like. So, we know a little bit about the beginning, and we know a lot about the modern times, but there's some fuzzy bits in the middle. So let's go back to the early days. So basically, a bard. It's a word that's used to describe a poet or a wordsmith of various kinds, like Shakespeare is described as the Bard of Avon. Generally speaking, in those contexts, bard is with a small b, I guess. But in the context of the Celtic traditions, then bard is with a big B. And we're talking about something more kind of specific. So essentially what we're talking about is a poet in the Celtic tradition, but there's kind of more to it than that. So let's go back to the start. So of what we know, anyway, what we know is that in the Iron Age, the Celtic peoples, and Julius Caesar writes about the Celtic peoples and the people of Britain. He talks about there being three particular classes of people in Celtic society who don't pay taxes and don't have to do military service and are held in very high esteem. One of which is the Druids, and one of which is the bards. So the bards were poets. I think they were much more than that, and it would seem that they belonged to were initiated into a cohesive order. So the Celts, they were a very sophisticated, so they're a brutal society, but a very sophisticated one. They didn't commit their own law to writing. That's not to say that they were illiterate, because a lot of them were very learned people who probably, were familiar with Latin and other things. But like many kind of tribal indigenous societies, they handed things down by word of mouth. And this is probably the origins of rhyming poetry. And if you, for example, genealogies, and bards were genealogists as well as poets. It's easy to kind of remember stuff if you make it rhyme. So if you have to remember, your ancestors, your father's father and your father's father's father, to kind of quote Monty Python, it helps, and you're going way back. It helps you to remember things by putting things into rhyme, and therefore helps you commit them to memory. And there's writings about the bards, having to, part of their training being to commit, huge amounts of verse to memory. So held in very high esteem. They were genealogists as well as poets, probably singers, and probably harpists too. Harp being the kind of the traditional Celtic instrument. And a political role, so they would have been satirists. They would have written tributes to their lords, their chiefs, and their kings. And we've got, there's some evidence of that. We've got some writings, because this goes right through from the Iron Age into the Dark Ages. So this is the kind of the age of the first bards. Okay, so mainly most of the bardic lore, most of the bardic tradition comes from Wales initially. That's not to say that it wasn't in the rest of the British Isles. All the British Isles would have been Celtic pre-Roman times, and for a long time afterwards as well. So that's the original bard. We think that the origin of the term Bardic Chair came from the fact that a chief or king would keep a chair or a place in his or a queen would keep his or her court, would be a place to be kept for the senior poet. And this is very similar to the origins of the poet laureate. So the poet laureate very much the same, the royal poet. Laureate coming from laurel, as in laurel wreaths. We know, that Caesar wore a laurel wreath. We know the expression "resting on your laurels." Lauded lauded and applauded, somebody that was highly honoured, and given recognition for their role as a poet. So the Poet Laureate and the Bardic Chair very, very closely, come from the same place really, and then they both kind of go off in different directions. So that's the early bards. Okay, now we know that Julius Caesar, well, the Romans, let's say this, I think it was other emperors as well, oppressed the Druids, and there's historical records of a massacre on Mona, as it was known, the Isle of Anglesey, which is the Druid headquarters. So the Druids in the Celtic tradition spread out through most of Europe at the time, and Anglesey in Wales was its college, maybe its headquarters as well, but certainly it was where people went to learn Druidry. And of course that includes Ireland. Ireland, particularly Ireland's got a strong bardic tradition. So when the Romans massacred the Druids and drove them underground, we don't know whether the bards were included in that, whether they were considered as, some people think that kind of bards were kind of apprentice druids. We don't know, we don't know this stuff. People will tell you that they do know. There's a lot of people in the druid, modern druid and sort of pagan world that think they know everything, but there's very few records. So, assuming that there was a druid order and also a bardic order, perhaps, and we don't know, the Druids went underground and became part of the establishment of the Bardic Order, which enabled them to continue. We really don't know. But what we do know is that throughout history, from the Dark Ages, various different points throughout the medieval period, the orders of bards in the Celtic tradition, mainly in places like Wales, were re-established and reconvened and were written about. And then sometimes the whole thing would sort of seem to disappear into obscurity and then arise. It would return again different. And if you look in the description box, I'll put lots of links in there. The best thing to read, the most informative document, one of the most informative documents available. There are some of the really good ones, but the one that goes into the most depth with the ancient history and the medieval history is Philip Shawcross. And he wrote a research document on Bardic chairs, and he talks a lot about the period in between the kind of the Iron Age and the Dark Ages of and the modern era, and talks about the different revivals that took place. So you can have a read of that, and he goes into a lot more detail. So we come forward further still. And we're around the 18th century, and this crosses over to the beginning of the 19th century. Druidry, the Celtic tradition, all these things became very popular in Europe, but particularly in the United Kingdom. And people like William Blake became very interested in the Druid tradition and wrote about it, and people started to meet and form Druid orders. And now the thing is, modern Druids think that it's all pagan. It's all kind of the Druid tradition is very much about is not a Christian thing, but actually it was mainly Masonic and with a very strong kind of Christian lookout. So the Bardic tradition kind of was re-embraced at the same time. So people like the main protagonist in all of this is a guy called Iolo Morgannwg. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. If there's any Welsh people around that want to correct me on that, I'd be grateful. Iolo Morgannwg, who lived in London, but was a true Welshman. And he claimed to have some ancient manuscripts that had both a kind of bardic and a druidic origin. And this is where most of the form, at least, of modern druidry comes from. This is where the modern bardic tradition was kind of revived. And he was instrumental in founding the Welsh Eisteddfod, and the Welsh Gorsedd. So the Welsh Gorsedd is a council of the great and the good, and they spelled Gorsedd, Gorsedd. And the Welsh Gorsedd kind of preside over the Welsh Eisteddfod, and the senior bard is Her Majesty the Queen. And not long ago, when we had Rowan Williams, who was Archbishop of Canterbury, who was of a very Welsh disposition. He was also a bard, and I think he became I'm not sure if he was the Grand Druid, Arch Druid, sorry. So they have an organisation which is Druidic in its tradition and also Bardic in its tradition. This is where the two things kind of come back together again, but secular, or if anything, kind of nominally Christian. Okay, so the Welsh Gorsedd is not a pagan organisation. It's a cultural organisation. It's about culture. It's about Welshness. It's about promoting the Welsh language, and it's about promoting the Welsh arts. So that is the Welsh Eisteddfod. And the Welsh Eisteddfod is quite well known. Out of all the bardic traditions that are out there, the Welsh Eisteddfod is the biggest and the most prominent. So if you've heard about the bardic tradition before, when people ask me about the Bardic Chair tradition, if they're Welsh, it's easy, because I just say, well, you've heard of the Welsh Eisteddfod, and they say yeah, and I say, well, it's a bit like that. But if you're trying to explain it to anyone from Scotland or England, they haven't got a clue. Cornwall's slightly easier, but we'll get into that in the next part because we're running a bit long on this video. I have to keep them short, so we're going to go into another part, and I will see you very soon. Blessings of the Arwen be upon you.